Commission shall proceed to invite Inspector Sulejaro to step forward to be sworn in to give his evidence. Hereby, the Bible, the cross, and the Lamb. I do hereby swear that the evidence I shall give before this commission of inquiry shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Doc, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Will you please, for the purposes of the record, state your full name to the commission?
My name is Emile Kwesi Aning.
Doc, the website of Kwesi Aning Peacekeeping Center says that you are the Director, Faculty of Academic Affairs and Research, and Clinical Professor of Peacekeeping Practice at Kennesaw State University, Atlanta. Is that the case?
That's correct.
There are also a number of reports in which you have been described as a security analyst and or a security expert. Do you accept those descriptions as well?
No, I take strong exception to the description of a security expert. I think that is pompous, and I don't ascribe to that. I think an analyst is the more appropriate description.
Very well. Is it okay with you for the commission to pick your brain on some security matters or happenings in the country?
Yes, I'm available. Yes.
Very well. Now, on the 14th of February 2019, the commission was informed by the Minister for National Security, Mr. Kandapa, that there was a security forum at Peduase Lodge. Were you a participant of that forum?
I was a participant.
Doc, will you be in position to give the commission an insight into the matters that were discussed at that forum?
Yes. The meeting at Peduase, if my memory serves me right, was the fourth in a series of meetings that were introduced by the Honorable Minister, bringing together the professional securocrats and analysts on the one side that sought to bring a better understanding, a much more trusting relationship between those who work on the security side on a day-to-day basis and those of us on the other side who, through our analysis and work, also comment and write on security. We had argued, or members of this committee had argued, that we thought the 3 to 4 hour conversations were not enough to allow us to drill down to the issues that we needed to talk about. So Peduase offered an opportunity to have a detailed conversation. There were 3 or 4 presentations, one discussing the perceptions and reality around insecurity in this country, presented by Colonel Festus Abuaje, retired. The second, if I remember correctly, was by Mr. Abrampa of CDD Ghana, who focused on the changing dynamics of vigilantism that represented a collaborative work that the KIPTC and the CDD had undertaken since 2006 The third presentation dealt with the CID, the deputy boss of the CID, on crime patterns and crimes in this country. The fourth, and I think the final presentation, the fourth presentation was by the Inspector General of Police. Then the final one was from Defense Intelligence, talking about the way that Burkina Faso and other parts of West Africa are being encircled, and of course, the potential threats and dangers to this country. And of course, there was an open conversation as to how we better understand and factor this into the security situation in Ghana.
Doc, did the firm come up with any recommendations at all as to how these matters discussed could be solved?
The forum subsequently split into 3 subcommittees, of which one dealt with the perceptions of insecurity, and the second, which I chaired, I think dealt with issues of vigilantism and how we could deal with it.
We'll have CDD and the other participants here tomorrow.
Yeah.
So for now, we will do away with that part of the testimony. Yes. Doc, you agree with me that there's been some incidents of electoral violence in this country for some time now. Now, as a security analyst, what do you think are some of the causes of this electoral violence?
Well, Counsel, I think there are multiple reasons that we can ascribe to it. The first, in my view, is that politics is not driven by shared principles, shared values, and shared norms. That's number one. Number two, that violence has become the most stable, currency in this country. 3, because we have a rentier state in which those who perform particular types of services, preferably the violent ones, that then transforms and eases those who have encouraged them to perform that violence, are then also given some positions. Fourth is that there seems to be a disconnect between the criminal acts that are perpetrated under the electoral laws and then the ability or the possibility of those people being punished. So over time, it's become almost natural and normal that violence becomes an aspect of our electoral processes. And we can see a direct correlation as on the one hand, elections or the democratic process deepens, and the factual number of violent groups and those who perpetrate these acts of violence. Okay, and those who actually perpetrate these acts of violence. So, for example, prior to the 2016 elections, we had 17 known violent groups. Right now, probably we are looking at 26, 27, all kinds of new names are coming up, all kinds of new groups are coming up. So violence is perceived to be extremely useful, it's beneficial, it transforms lives, it creates new identities, and it gives access to power.
Now, in your view, what are some of the measures we can take as a country to prevent, or if not possible, minimize the occurrences of these violence?
I think the horse has almost bolted from the stables. And let me talk about the minimization first. It's almost impossible for us to minimize, precisely because the public discourse is one thing. What happens behind closed doors is a totally different thing. If we trace the historicity of the violence that we are talking about, we've seen the transformation of foot soldiers who, as part of the lumpen class, could be used, organized, dismissed, abused, spat out, and basically said, you are not needed anymore. Foot soldiers performed particular types of services, intimidated people, disrupted rallies, tore down campaign posters. But over time, started to organize, got more power, got a better understanding of how to use the tools of violence, and we are beginning to see a disturbing development where those who organized, funded, promised, and failed to deliver are now being attacked. Now, when you use violence to attack representatives of the state, it is not the police that fights you, it's the armed forces. Unfortunately, we are seeing a lacuna here where it's the police service that we are still using, whilst we are seeing a disturbing transformation of foot soldiers to armed and organized vigilantes, and increasingly to becoming armed militias and hired mercenaries. The prevention side is once more also rhetorical. We have institutions that can and ought to have prevented the development all the way to where we are. Unfortunately, those institutions have not been able to do so. Now, if you read Act 350 of 1970, that is the Ghana Police Services Act, the core functions of the Ghana Police Service is to protect lives and to protect property. Since the 1960s, the mid-1960s, that has almost become impossible. Every commission of inquiry that has been established concerning the Ghana Police Service, its functionality and its challenges, from the Boyce report, the Young report, the Tibiru report, the Okujeto report, and then the Archer Commission report, have consistently spoken about the need to strengthen the capacity, but even more importantly, the independence of the police service to be able to perform its statutory functions. That over time has been undermined to such an extent that we have a hollowed out institution, incapable, unwilling, frightened to prevent. We have the Peace Council that can also do some prevention work. And also certainly my own institution, through research and training, can also do some prevention work. But Prevention Council, you would agree with me, depends on a will, a transparent, principally driven desire that the institutions mandated by law to prevent will be given the freedom to prevent. My final point. We have a National Election Security Task Force that routinely during elections ought to be mandated and then operationalized to ensure that we don't have the violence that we see. But somewhere in the Constitution also, so for example, the Election Security Task Force is not supported by law. The Inspector General of Police will establish this at the national level, municipal, metropolitan, district, regional, all the way down. It cascades down. But the Constitution somewhere also says no organization can be formed that contradicts the functions of the National Security Council. So the prevention framework and the prevention architecture itself is self-contradictory. So the capacity to prevent is undermined by the multiplicity of legal frameworks that we have in the country.
Very well. Look, you stated that prior to 2016, the 2016 elections,
yep,
we knew of 17 known violent groupings. Were you by that referring to what has come to be described in the country as vigilante groups?
I think that is a misnomer. If you look at the geographical spread, the franchising of their activities, their capacity first to have access to the tools of violence, and their willingness to use those tools of violence, and the increasing loss of control by those who organize them, then I think the word vigilante is very narrow. If, Council, you accept my argument that we've seen a shift from foot soldierism to what, yes, we, as a misnomer, call vigilantes, and I will now call militia groups, armed, violent, ready to sell their skills to the highest bidder. And to come back to your prevention question, institutional mechanisms and frameworks with very little capacity to actually prevent, then yes. So if you permit me for a split second, I'd like to race through these groups and hopefully also give me a chance to talk about the new ones. So prior to the 2016 elections, we had the Aluta Boys, Bukuri Song, Tuhazi, Pentagon, Gwewa Youth, Azoka Boys, 66 Bench, Al-Qaeda, Al Jazeera, NATO Forces, Rasta Boys, Sese Group, Invisible Forces, Bamba Boys. Oh, you are writing, okay. I'll hand you the paper later on. Yeah. Bamba Boys, Delta Forces, Bolga Bulldogs, and the Kandahar Boys. Post-2016, and this is where the franchising and the nature of the rentier state that makes violence a currency then comes in. Post the elections, we have the Eagle Forces, the Lions, the Hawks, Dragons, Burma Camp, Ashanti Vigilante Group. We have also the Green Mambas. Council, let me try to explain these names. I said earlier on that when people decide to challenge the authority of the state, they do so by also trying to send a signal to those who may potentially be their supporters of their strength, invisibility, capacity for violence. And so we are looking at the choice of very iconic names, brand names: Pentagon, Al Jazeera, Al-Qaeda, NATO Forces, Dragons, Hawks, Mambas. What do these names signify and symbolize? They symbolize global news, and therefore every time these militias act in Ghana, the UN comments on it, the African Union comments on it, and ECOWAS comments on it. Their capacity and willingness to use violence against the state. And we've seen instances where ministers have been threatened. This is a development that a couple of years ago would not have been possible, and nobody would have dared to attack a representative of the state. But it's also about security, or more appropriately, insecurity. But it also talks about swiftness, dexterity, speed, flexibility, and a viciousness to deliver the blows that they want. But the names are also symptomatic of flamboyance, of power, of invisibility, and of fear. So we are seeing a transformation of these groups into something more organized, willing and prepared to take on the power of the state. So if we've, in 2016, 2012, 2016, thought of these groups as vigilantes, I think in the aftermath of the 2016 elections, something else has shifted. It's brought in a very disturbing hue that I would like to speak to for 10 seconds. Prior to the 2016 elections, or maybe a little earlier, politicians did not stand up to tell us that I will form a vigilante group. They were perceived as nasty intangibles that no one wanted to align with. The shift I'm talking about is that there's a certain willingness and pride in saying, I will form one of these groups. But the power dynamics are shifting. They are shifting in the sense that we see the narrative and the choice of words from members of these groups and their leaders becoming more aggressive. Example, it's on record that post the attack on the court case, on the judiciary in Kumasi, the leader of that group then threatened those who had spoken up, including myself, that if you don't like the judgment given, you can go to court. I don't fear the court. This is a challenge to the state, and I think my argument is we need to be careful about it.
Very well. Now, Doc, the president at the last State of the Nation's address asked political parties, mainly MPP and NDC, to meet up and fashion out a way out of this vigilantism situation. Are you aware of that?
I listened to aspects of the speech.
Very well. Now, I've come across an article which seemed to be saying that, according to you, we shouldn't rush the fight of vigilantism, but rather we should build trust. Doc, what did you mean when you said that? Did you really say that, actually?
I said it, and I think it's one of the rather gentler statements I've made. By providing time and exit timelines for the struggle against vigilantism, I think it shows a rather easy way out. That does not reflect the reality on the ground. Why do political parties driven, or who should be driven by shared norms, shared values, and particularly principles? Principles are unshakable, and principles don't change. Truth is truth. Why do political parties since 1951 continuously seen violence as a currency to such an extent that politics and politicians, both as individuals and organizations, fund, encourage, train, and arm some of these groups? It means there's a fundamental structural misconception and misunderstanding about those who need to provide security. And herein counsel lies some of the difficulties that this useful, appropriate call would need to look at. The establishment of foot soldiers, vigilantes, and armed militias have over time represented the lack of trust in our politics and a lack of trust in the statutory security forces. What it means in practice is that because both parties have been in power before, and because they know what they have done to the statutory security forces, they know that when they are in opposition, the party, the incumbent party, will do a similar thing. That creates a sense of insecurity And that insecurity leads to the establishment and the arming and the training of these militias. What that means in practice is that the mistrust that has served as the fulcrum around which these groups have been formed just cannot be wished away. So my argument there is simple. Yes, we need to deal with the vigilantes, but you cannot just wish them away, because these groups have become economic groups. They've been infiltrated by criminals. They have evidence, recorded statements of those who promised them goodies. They are armed and they know how to use it. But because they've been formed by individuals and groups who mistrusted the system of providing security, my argument is simple. Let's begin the process of building trust between and amongst those who established these groups. But even more importantly, you asked me that important question about the prevention. How do we negotiate around the difficulties in which we have placed ourselves? Are there national institutions that can play the honest broker? And I think the level of suspicion is so deep that I also argued in that same interview that we shouldn't be shy as a nation to say, probably the UN should come and help, play the honest broker, or the African Union. Because in disaggregating those who are members of these groups, the economic interest, their geographical location, what they use their strength and equipment for when they are not being used, needs a trust-building process that takes quite some time. Legislation will just not end this process. It's gotten roots in our society, creates economic incentives, and people use that. And therefore, we need a sober, long-term process in which we create trust first to come around the table, start having the conversation, and then begin a disaggregation process of the specific issue areas that we need to tackle. That takes a lot of time.
Now, Doc, that brings us to the question of ownership of these groupings. The Commission has been given two different explanations. One says that the political parties themselves do not own vigilante groupings, for want of a better word. The other says that the political parties own them, whereas the other group says they are rather owned by individuals. Now, what is your stand?
I think it's a conflation of the two. I've spoken about discourses and rhetoric before, and there are four voices when we come to dealing with politically sensitive and security-sensitive matters in this country. One is the manner in which we speak mellifluous Oxbridge English to the rest of the world, in which we use all the buzzwords. The second is when we speak to ordinary Ghanaians. Very, similar to the first form of speech. The third is when we are behind closed doors, hopefully amongst like-minded people, and the phraseology that we use, in which we use poetic phraseology to justify violence and to encourage people to deal with violence. The third mode of communication, and the fourth one, which I call the non-verbal form of communication, the body language that says, counsel, please, go ahead. We shall protect you. Those two forms of communication, the closed door, like-minded forms of communication, and the non-verbal communication, is how we need to understand whether these groups are formed by political parties or by individuals. Irrespective of which group forms it, in no political documentation in this country will you find an advocacy for political violence. No manifesto since the 1950s, all the way until the manifestos for the 2016 election. Nobody has written it down. But if we take the statements from political party leaders, the glorifying language, the discourses that seeks to dispel what they themselves have said, trivializes and romanticizes violence. There's an everydayness to violence. I'll kill you. I'll shoot you. I'll deal with you. You know who I am. You wait and see. That has seeped into our subconsciousness in such a manner that if you threatened to do something to someone, it no more generates. And it is that everydayness of violence captured by the behavior of the former representatives of political parties and individual leaders who may be supporters of that party that has led to where we are.
Thank you, Doc. Mr. Chairman, your witness.
Dr. Aning, thank you very much for coming to share your expertise with us on this very troubling matters. You have spoken a lot about the motivation for these groups to exist. So, and the fact that they are growing, which means whatever has given birth to them is prospering. You have also told us that it is difficult to prevent, but we have to do something. And I'm asking this power, for want of a better word, call it mediation, although we are talking of honest broker. Do you think we really should be considering, apart from, a product of this intervention you are suggesting, do you think we really ought to face up to the fact that we need a DDR?
A DDR is only one component of it. We've glorified violence in this country for so long. At the last count, there were close to 1.5 to 2 million unregistered guns in this country, both locally manufactured and those that are smuggled into this country. Late last year, I traveled the Burkina Faso border, the north, and down from Hamlet to Elubo. There are no boundaries. The levels of collusion between those who smuggle guns into this country and those who ought to be preventing or protecting us is immense. Guns have been found in this country to have emanated as far away as the Democratic Republic of Congo. French Second World War stocks have been found in this country. The Ashanti region has become the entry port for the entry and distribution of guns across this sub-region. So DDR is key. But Madam Commissioner, you also recognize that when guns have become the most crucial forms of livelihood, withdrawing them from communities and people's hands means that we need to replace it with alternative livelihoods. In this country, we've spoken DDR, but only at a rhetorical level. In 2005, we did a major paper for the UN that put available guns, unregistered guns in this country, close to 500,000. If we take the usual attrition rate, and I'm happy Commissioner Champong is here, the international attrition rate is 20% over time. So if we take 20% of those guns in 2005 out of the 500,000 to have been destroyed by now, that leaves us with 480,000 guns. Unfortunately, the local manufacture of guns and the free flow across our boundaries, and also because we are good in providing storage, transportation, and further export, that instead of seeing the attrition rate of 20% reducing the volumes, we've actually seen an exponential growth. And because there's an increasing demand, particularly because of these groups also, these vigilantes turning into militias, the DDR process is going to be fairly tricky, and that is why my request for the UN to join in this process is key, because they will be able to help us to find the money to create alternative livelihoods. But we also discovered in several parts of this country when we did that research on small arms, that there are sophisticated traditional means of stockpiling these guns as equally good as the stockpiling mechanisms of the Ghana Armed Forces. In the same study that is free, that we can download, with the exception of the Ghana Armed Forces, none of our security agencies has a stockpile management mechanism in which it is defensible, it is professionally acceptable, and technically worthwhile. So with the exception of the Ghana Armed Forces, we saw offices where guns were stockpiled in storerooms, stockpiled in rooms where there were broken chairs. But my worry is that this UNDP government of Japan document that we interviewed 10,000 people in this country to publish has just basically been gathering dust. So yes, DDR is just one component of this call to ban vigilantism, but probably that is the most technically difficult part of it.
Thank you. I meant the broader DDR, not just guns, buyback gun program, but alternative livelihoods and so on. I want to float this past you also because of something you said about the everydayness of the political violence now. I believe you and I know that in every situation where there's been a state collapse, the atrocities recorded have been things that have been around the people which they came to accept. And so when the state collapsed, they became the order of the day. Do you think, as civil society, we must delegitimize the everydayness of political violence?
Madam Commissioner, probably that is one of the most important things that we ought to do as civil society. But we also need to recognize that there's a growing uncivil society. Groups of individuals who speak the same language that the proper civil society speaks. But I think this has become, this must be a collective, general demand, because these guns are beginning to pose an existential threat. If you permit me, let me come back and speak about the broader alternative livelihoods. If you travel around this country, everyone who makes guns can also make a pepper crusher, tomato crusher, nut crusher, can build steel chairs, can build hospital beds, can build the pruners that we use to pluck cocoa, which we import. The 2005 study mapped out the technological skills of traditional manufacturers and what they themselves, in their words, wanted help to do. So creating alternative livelihoods within the context of the broader DDR shouldn't be too
I understand members of the public want to know what DDR means.
Okay. Demobilization, demilitarization,
disarmament,
and then
rehabilitation, reintegration.
Yeah.
Choose your pick.
Yeah, or pick your choose. So we can do it because few groups are actually only gun manufacturers. Because the pricing is from 50 cedis to 1,500, depending on the sophistication of the gun, and people may come once a month, twice a month, 3 times a month. They also have alternatives, so were we to identify the skill sets and to encourage them, then I think, yes, it can be done.
I was waiting to hear the delegitimization by civil society and the denunciation that civil society can contribute to psychologically undermining this everydayness that you talked about.
I think on the theoretical level, the delegitimization is key, but I think civil society engagement on the security side is an elite-driven process. So you can count the number of people who understand first the technicalities, but also the willingness to speak out. Talking against the everydayness of violence, of criminality, has a personal cost. You've got to get a backbone. You've almost got to get a kamikaze mentality and a willingness that there's a higher calling, and therefore you are willing and prepared to write and to speak. It can be quite dangerous doing the kind of things that civil society does when they want to speak up against what we are talking about. Ensuring that the everydayness and acceptance of violence, abuse, criminal conduct is actually stopped. There is a price that one pays for it. And that is why, though in our private spaces, we talk about our concern about guns, the violence in society, the threats to the everydayness of life, very few people are also willing and prepared to stand up and be counted. I think in talking about the everydayness and the role of civil society, I think we need to be conscious of the fact that there's a price to pay personally. And therefore, we shouldn't expect the critical mass of individuals to join this fight.
The press is here. They control our hearts and minds. Is there a place for them in this detoxification, mental detoxification that I'm asking?
A role. Unfortunately, the press itself, more often than not, does not have the knowledge base and the platform to engage in a nuanced manner the complexity of the issue that we are talking about. And I think all the commissioners and the council have experienced a situation where you are called by the media, no introduction. How are you? They are not even too sure about your name, where you work, and they are asking you, look, we want to talk about vigilantes. What should I ask you? I think the media and probably the GIJ must begin a process of specialization. There are too many generalists that allow, and to come back to the council's question about how I want to to be described. There is an inflation in the use of the word expert. So that every Tom, Dick, and Harry is now an expert. Now, for those who know discourse analysis, the use and choice of particular words either encourages or basically prevents people from even asking further questions. So expert X has spoken, and that is just it. But more often than not also, those who produce or host this program themselves have not done any background work on the topic prior to asking. So, Council, thank you very much for doing some research and then printing that one out. So the media has a crucial and a critical role. But critical journalism needs a new type of training, a new type of journalist who is willing to ask the tough questions. More often than not, by the time they say 4 words, you know what the question is about. So to detoxify the society and to encourage ordinary people to bring their views onto the table, yes, the press is key, very crucial in this time.
I am certain that they will rise to the occasion. We have had situations in this country where the press has become a great ally when we democratized and opened up the public space and everybody could express an opinion. I'm sure you recall the days when people would say anything, and the days when you said something you shouldn't say, the host actually took you off, and gradually it moderated the language that people put in the public space. So I'm certain that the press can be a useful ally in this endeavor. But sometimes we accept things we are used to seeing. We don't hold political leaders accountable when things have happened. We, in fact, glorify lawlessness. And so it becomes attractive. Everybody wants 5 minutes of stardom. And sometimes that's the only way people can be stars. And you are saying that we have to take away the glamour because it has become a flamboyant enterprise. The only reason people engage in flamboyance is for stardom. So we have to delegitimize some of these things. And I'm thankful that you referred to this 2005 study. I hope we have access to it so that we can link the issues that we have been set up to investigate to the freedom with which people can purchase and even manufacture guns. Talking of DDR, I have just come across a new principle known as the Cobra principle. Apparently, if you start some such project without thinking it right through to how people will react, people will actually manufacture things in order to bring them up to come and sell. So you become another market for the guns. So I believe this is something that has to be studied in more detail, a wider national conversation engaged in for us to take action. But I believe that the delegitimization and detoxification should be engaged in by everybody because nobody undertakes atrocities that are foreign to the way they live. Thank you.
Dr. Aning, thank you very much for your testimony. I have only one question. You saw the events that took place at a location near Abawaleshi polling station, which triggered the setting up of this commission of inquiry. You have stated that it would require a long-term process to create trust to address the problem that faces us today with these militia groups. We are going to have an election next year, 2020. What steps do you recommend should be put in place? Immediate short-term recommendations. To address to meet the 2020 election so that we don't have a recurrence of what took place in Labawaleshi.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Short. I was teaching in Hiroshima when the violence happened. So I wasn't actually in the country. But it didn't come to me as a surprise at all. So let me speak a little bit to the steps that we need to take. The first step is to bring sanity back into our security system. Let us know who is responsible for what and takes whose orders, so that when the hierarchy fails, somebody is held accountable. What do I mean? When we have statutory security forces, paid for, fed, housed, transported by the Republic of Ghana, it is crucial and important that they are permitted and allowed to perform their functions. The creation of militias on one hand, empowered to perpetrate crimes and atrocities against the people of Ghana, but even more disturbingly, undermining statutory functions of the National Security Council by forming a quasi non-recognized statutory SWAT team is dangerous to the security services and undermines loyalty. The functions of the National Security Council are very clear. It takes measures to safeguard the internal and external security of Ghana, collects information relating to our security, assesses and appraises the objectives, commitments, and the risks to the country, and takes appropriate measures. If the video footage I saw is correct, and Chair, I can assure you that as an ordinary Ghanaian, the embarrassment that it caused because of the questions that were asked of to me in Hiroshima is something that we should hope should never happen again. But when you have statutory security forces who do not know of the existence of other forces who can be commanded and ordered to perform in the public space in the way that we saw, is disturbing. When we see the lack of coordination and decision-making, when we see the provision of equipment to non-statutory groups that the formal forces don't have, then we need to come back to the drawing board and to say, what is the order and the hierarchy for making decisions to interpose security forces to bring about calm? That breakdown in order and the hierarchy is one of the most serious threats if we don't correct it towards 2020. Because what it means is that when someone has served for 35 years, either in the police service, immigration, customs, and armed forces, and all of a sudden sees the deployment of troops that the commander doesn't know about, whose existence was not clear, it undermines the morale of the former forces, and it undermines potentially the loyalty of those forces to the state. Liberia just did not happen. Sierra Leone just did not happen. La Côte d'Ivoire just did not happen. It is these processes over time that undermines and hollows out statutory institutions. Commissioner Short almost 2/3 of Burkina Faso has been taken over by terrorists, and they are coming down south. What led to the Burkina army unwilling, incapable, disinterested in protecting the state? Because the mechanisms for giving an order and deploying troops have been hollowed out over time. And we are seeing a reflection of that happening here. Ayawaso, I think we should be thankful, happened. Because now we can look at our face and say, how did we get to where we are? How do we pull back? So in the short term, yes, we need to bring the structures back in alignment. Because it should not be possible for a junior minister or any other person to move those troops well armed, well fed, well equipped with the logistics to perform the way they perform. It's put this nation in a bad light in terms of our conception of the rule of law, our respect for human rights, and it also commissioned the tensions within the security forces. So when you saw some of the films, and if you slow them down to 1/16 of the speed of the shutter, and you saw their dressing, their sidearms, their clothing, then you wonder, hang on a minute, where are these guys from? Who commands them? Where did they get the funding from? Who do they report to? And I think we need to answer all these questions in the short term and in the very short term, because we need to recreate that sense of hierarchy, of order, and of command and control. It cannot and it must not be allowed to fester.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning and thank you, Dr. Emile. As usual, having listened to and interacted with you over a long period of time, I'm mentally refreshed anytime I hear you, but also continually horrified by the horror in which we seem to be plunging ourselves as a nation. Let me pick your thoughts on just 3 issues. One, do you think, or some people think, that the issues involved in the whole concept of terrorism, which are sort of, from which the armed militias are only a substructure, the issue of terrorism has been simplified in this country, and therefore the solutions being proffered by, as you say, people who are not experts are also simplified.
Yes, I think there is a misconception about the terrorist psyche. And I'm going to say this based on my earlier work for the African Union as its head of counterterrorism. One is the need to understand the processes and the mechanisms that transforms those of us in this room to be able to take a weapon against the state. Two, terrorism works best when it sows fear. Most people make the mistake of thinking that terrorists seek to kill people. No, terrorists don't seek to kill people. They seek to maim people and to hurt people. When you die, you are buried, we drink some Guinness, there's a lot of hula baloo, that is it. But when you are hurt, your legs blown off, your arm blown off, probably there's a shrapnel in your head, it takes the average of 4 to 6 people to look after one hurt person. That undermines your capacity to fight back as much as possible. Unfortunately, we tend to think that that is not what happens. The solutions that we have sought to prefer are at best comical and at worst, well, not worth what is written on the back of a postage stamp. And let me give you an example. We are reactive when things happen. 2 examples. When this country was under threat a couple of years ago, an official government statement said, if you see something, please report it. But report it to who? Where? What are we supposed to look at? A bearded man in a long kaftan, shaved hair, no mustache. So the information metrics that should allow the ordinary population to say, we understand this threat and we understand what we ought to look for and to report, doesn't exist. The second is the rather haphazard training that is given prior to and after any threat level. So, for example, immediately there's some incident in Burkina Faso, every guard towards a police, a hotel, is given some basic training. And you ask them, what are you looking for? I'm looking for a bomb. I'm looking for grenades. Okay? So the quality of the training that sensitizes those who should be frontline preventive or prevention or officers is extremely weak. Let me give a typical example of this morning. I walked all the way through and sat out there. Nobody checked me. Nobody. It was only after the commissioners had entered that some little thing was doing thing out there. So our consciousness about how to protect ourselves and the nature of the threat is that we need to change. So I have 3 suggestions, Commissioner Champong. One is to say first, what is the code of conduct that both uniformed and ununiformed operatives would need to use? What are the standard operating procedures? Because this building is such an important historical site that for the performance that I saw out there, all the way into this room, is intolerable and totally unacceptable. The second relates to designing as a nation a threat template and how we calculate the levels of threat that we see. The third is about appointing people who have the capacity and skill sets onto the different security committees that we have. Let me give an example. The Security and Intelligence Services Act, Act 526 of 1996, makes this country one of the most, in inverted commas, protected countries in terms of having the National Security Council, the Regional Security Council, the Metropolitan, the Municipal, and the District Security Councils. Let all those who sit on those councils be given some very basic understanding and analysis of the threats that we face. Right now, with the exception of a few members on those councils, most of them, with due respect, don't have very limited understanding of what Act 526 says. Actually, quite a number of them have not read Act 526. So there's a need for 2 things. 1, better security literacy, and 2, better security management. Conflating the 2 will help us, Commissioner Achampong, to better understand the dynamics of the terrorist threats that we see.
My second question, before that, I will add to your example from this morning. If you go to Golden Tulip in Kwesi, I mean, if you are there for 3 days, anytime you go out and you come back, they search you. So one day I was with Mr. Sifakai and others. So Kwame asked why are you bothering? We've been going out and coming back about 4 times a day, he always stop us and open our boot. The guy said, they say we should look for bomb. Then Kwame said, do you know what is a bomb? He said, no. Would you see a bomb if you saw one? He said, no. So why are you stopping? And he said, they say we should look for a bomb. And that's how it is in most of the public institutions. And incidentally, even in Nigeria, where they have had a lot of problems, at the hotel in Abuja, it was the same system. Then my second question is, arising out of what you said, you and I know that, principally, in theory, the national security structure is supposed to, or at least the secretariat, the law talks about a coordinator, and the coordinator is to coordinate the work of the other state institutions that deal with national security to enable them to work more effectively, to help, to assist them in terms of logistics, because going by the normal system of procuring some of these logistics are rather tedious and difficult. But gradually, you know from your studies that all of us have switched on to this idea that national security itself is an armed institution, and that they can do anything they like. And so we are building up the forces under them. The minister said there are about 1,000 now, which is probably bigger than some of the police regions. I don't know what it will be in 2022, maybe 3,000, 4,000. So they'll probably be bigger than a battalion of the Ghana Armed Forces. So where are we going to? Where are we ending this militarization of the national security structure? What sort of things do we need to look back on and to add to the law, both to make them more effective in terms of their core duties, but to restrict them from raising by themselves a second armed force of Ghana?
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Champong. And when you were the boss, it was always a great pleasure to meet and to talk, so it's nice to see you again. One is that there is a gross misunderstanding of what the National Security Council should do. First is that we need to bring intelligence back in. And I'm not talking about the intelligence that says, you know, Kwesi Aning succeeded in taking my girlfriend and therefore he's a terrorist. No. The sophisticated pooling of different strands of information and the capacity and ability to triangulate and to analyze them in a manner that tells us, using the technology that we now have, pinpoint, to drill down, to prevent, and to ensure that, you know, these guys don't hurt us. Number two, once more, to come back to my earlier point, it's about institutional failure. A number of institutions have to send annual reports to Parliament, particularly the 3 parliamentary committees whose functions border on security. First, the Finance Committee. When we have 1,000 operatives under the National Security Council, armed, who don't take instructions from the formal, statutory, hierarchical structure, that's a cause for worry. So I think it's incumbent upon these 3 parliamentary committees to demand and to invite those ministers responsible for raising this army to appear before it and to answer questions about why they need, what is the threat perception, what are the vision and the mission of establishing this alternative armed force, how it threatens, potentially undermines the loyalty of the statutory forces, who pays for them, who accounts for the money, These are issues that Act 526 of 1996 sought to prevent. And that is why I think the appointment of a substantive minister for security is useful. Because these are the questions that Parliament must be asking the substantive minister of security. Unfortunately, as I've said several times, that does not seem to be happening. And we see it with your former agency also. The Police Council must be sending an annual report to Parliament to discuss the performance of the Ghana Police Service. Neither of the committees of Parliament have asked the Ghana Police Service to submit this report. In fact, in the aftermath of the promulgation of the 1992 Constitution, the Council has only sent one report to Parliament. So the National Security Council can establish almost a battalion strength, armed men to the teeth, with vehicles on which the word police is written on it, but there's no GP number on those vehicles. And we took it for granted. So Parliament must begin to play its role of questioning, of inviting people to appear before it, asking for documents, asking for evidence, so that we can ensure that this does not happen. Because turning the Security Council into a quasi-independent security force, or controlling a quasi-independent security force, does not inure to our democracy. And I think Ayawaso was a tip of the iceberg. As I've said, it creates an opportunity for us to question how we got to where we are and how best we can pull back from the brink.
Last question. Following all that you said, what is your view, or what are your opinions on strengthening the institutions of state, the formal institutions that should lead the fight against issues like terrorism and so forth? I'm particularly thinking of the criminal justice group as one composite group, all those institutions under them, so that together with the national security setup and the armed forces, we can see a pattern, we can see a structure that is better prepared to be more effective in the future against terrorism.
Commissioner Champon, institutions do matter. But institutions only function when their political masters allow them to do so. If we take all the institutions that over time have failed to deliver, it's not because of the lack of technical skill sets by the individuals who are in there, but it's because there's a consistent historical intrusion into the performance of these institutions. So you mentioned terrorism. That is at the very extreme of the acts of violence that we see. But what about extremist tendencies that are beginning to grow in our society? Because of the porosity of our borders, those who seek to head the state come in and out. And for me as a civilian who can travel around the boundaries, make interviews, get access to the information, sometimes when I hear, oh, we don't have access to information, I truly do wonder. So we should be focusing on extremist groups. Where are they located? How do people get recruited, mobilized, and then indoctrinated to become extremists? What should we be looking out for? Okay. Should we allow just anybody to say, come and apply for a visa and I'll take you to X region of the world? How do they come back? Who follows them? Okay. So though the institutions are there, we tend to see security in an altruistic sense. oh, we are all sweet and kind, we all believe in God, we are good Ghanaians, we are hospitable. My argument is that we need a much more instrumental lens to say that, look, we are humans, but also the nature of human beings is that some of us can be bad. We haven't reached there yet. We need to start the process of getting there.
Dr. Aning, thank you very much for your testimony. It's been quite useful to the Commission. You may leave now. Thank you.